Long before he became the most famous wanderer in all of Greek mythology, before his name echoed through centuries of stories and songs, before poets would craft epics around his trials and tribulations that would inspire humanity for millennia to come, there was simply a boy born on a rocky island in the Ionian Sea. His name was Odysseus, and his arrival into the world was marked not by prophecy or divine intervention from the gods, but by something far more subtle and ultimately far more powerful. The gift of a mind sharp enough to cut through problems that seemed unsolvable to ordinary men. His father was Laertes, king of Ithaca, a man of modest means and quiet dignity, who ruled over an island so small that most maps of the ancient world barely acknowledged its existence. The kingdom was not wealthy. The land was rocky and difficult to farm. There were no great ports, no valuable trade routes, no obvious advantages that would make Ithaca important in the larger world of Greek politics and power. His mother was Anticlea, a woman whose lineage connected her directly to Hermes himself, the god of cunning and wit and strategic thinking. Anticlea carried in her blood the divine gift of intelligence and the ability to see angles that others missed. She would pass this inheritance to her son like something more valuable than gold or land or armies could ever be. Born on an island that was neither particularly powerful nor especially wealthy, surrounded by kingdoms vastly greater than his own, surrounded by more impressive kingdoms in every direction, Odysseus seemed destined for obscurity. He would inherit a rocky kingdom that barely sustained its population. He would rule over a few thousand subjects scattered across a speck of land in the Ionian Sea. He would spend his life in the shadow of greater powers, the powerful kingdoms of Mycenae and Sparta and Athens, all of which overshadowed his small island realm. Most boys born into such circumstances accepted this fate with resignation, understanding that they would live quiet lives in relative obscurity, never achieving greatness, never becoming the subject of legends and songs. But Odysseus was never most boys. The child who grew up in Ithaca's stone halls was profoundly different from other princes born in Greece during that era. While other young nobles trained obsessively in the gymnasium and the training grounds with swords and spears, eager to build muscles and prove their martial prowess through physical dominance and demonstrations of strength, Odysseus spent equal time, sometimes more time, in the company of mentors and teachers who taught him something equally valuable and infinitely more rare. They taught him the power of words. They taught him the mechanics of strategy and long-term thinking. They taught him the deep understanding of human nature that could accomplish what strength alone could never achieve. They taught him to observe, to question, to think several moves ahead, the way a master player of board games thinks through the implications of each move before making it. His nurse, Euryclea, noticed early that the child's eyes held an unusual quality of intelligence. The boy did not simply observe the world around him as most children do. He scanned situations like a merchant examining cloth for quality, looking not just at immediate surfaces, but searching for deeper patterns, searching for hidden connections, trying to understand the invisible architecture that made things work the way they did. Where other children saw a problem and despaired, Odysseus saw a puzzle. Where they saw insurmountable obstacles, he saw angles of approach that others had overlooked. Where they accepted situations as fixed and unchangeable, he saw possibilities for leverage and change. By the time Odysseus reached manhood, strong enough to be a capable warrior, educated enough to command respect in council, old enough to rule a kingdom, he had become something rare in the ancient world. He became a prince whose strength lay not in the size of his muscles or the sharpness of his blade, but in the architecture of his mind and his ability to see what others could not. He could negotiate treaties that stronger kings could only achieve through years of brutal warfare. He could see solutions to problems that seemed fundamentally unsolvable to every other advisor and strategist. He could speak with authority not because of his physical presence or his impressive lineage, but because people sensed that his words carried weight, earned through genuine thought and careful observation. And then came the crisis that would define his early life, the question of Helen of Sparta. The woman whose beauty would eventually launch 1,000 ships and inspire an entire war was already becoming legendary when Odysseus was still a young man, working to establish himself as a leader of worth and wisdom within the broader Greek world. She was the daughter of Zeus himself, or so the stories claimed, though the specifics of her parentage varied depending on which version of her birth story you believed. Every prince and king in Greece wanted Helen, not just as a wife, but as a prize, as a possession that carried with it immense prestige, power, and the favour of the gods themselves. Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world, according to universal acclaim. To marry her would be to align oneself with fortune itself, to become the man chosen by the most desirable woman alive. Kings sent their sons, princes travelled from distant lands. Warriors of great renown journeyed to Sparta with hopes of winning Helen's hand. The competition was fierce, the desire absolute, the number of suitors almost impossible to manage. Helen's father, Tyndareus, king of Sparta, found himself facing an impossible diplomatic and political situation. How could he choose among so many powerful suitors without creating dangerous enemies among all those he rejected? To choose one suitor over all the others would be to elevate one kingdom above its peers, inevitably creating resentment, jealousy, and the potential for serious conflict. Yet to refuse all of them was equally impossible. They would not accept rejection from a king they outnumbered in power. The problem seemed completely intractable. Every solution led to more problems. Every choice led to resentment and potential war. It was Odysseus who provided the elegant solution. And notably, he had not even come to Sparta as one of Helen's suitors himself. His island kingdom was too small, his resources too modest for him to seriously compete for such a prestigious marriage. He was not expected to win her hand. By every measure of power and prestige, he was outclassed by nearly every other suitor present. But recognizing the political danger that the situation represented, recognizing that the competition for Helen could tear the Greek world apart and create enemies and resentment across every kingdom, Odysseus approached Tyndareus and offered an idea. It was not an idea born from power or strength. It was an idea born from pure intellectual strategy and understanding of human nature. Let all the suitors, he suggested, swear a binding oath to one another. Each man would vow that whichever suitor Helen ultimately chose, he would support that man completely and without reservation. Moreover, if anyone ever challenged the chosen husband, attempting to steal Helen away through force or deception, all the other suitors would stand united in his defense. They would come to his aid as allies, not as enemies or competitors. This way, every suitor would maintain honor despite rejection. Every suitor would have a stake in protecting the eventual winner. Potential conflict would be transformed into unified strength. The competition that could have torn Greece apart would instead create bonds of loyalty that connected all the major Greek kingdoms. The oath was brilliant not just in its intellectual cleverness, but in its fundamental fairness. It satisfied everyone involved by transforming potential enemies into allies, united competing powers under a common cause, and solved Tyndareus's seemingly impossible diplomatic crisis without requiring him to make a decision that would anger half the Greek world. The grateful king offered Odysseus a reward for his wisdom and his solution to the crisis. He offered Odysseus wealth, power, influence, whatever the clever young man might desire. Rather than request more land or a position among the great kingdoms or political power or wealth, Odysseus made a choice that revealed his character and his values. He requested the hand of Penelope, a princess of neighboring Elis, a woman related to Sparta, but not as prestigious or celebrated as Helen herself. It was a choice that revealed his intelligence in a different way. He wanted not the greatest prize available, but the right one. He wanted a woman of intelligence and character, someone whose bloodline and reputation suggested nobility of mind to match his own. He returned to Ithaca with his bride, and for a brief, shining moment, his life seemed settled into a predictable and pleasant pattern. He had a wife of intelligence and worth. He had a kingdom to rule. He had the respect of his peers throughout Greece for his wisdom. A son was born, or perhaps was already on the way when Odysseus made his fateful decision. His name was Telemachus, and he would grow up knowing his father more through legend and the accounts of others than through daily presence and direct experience. For a time, Odysseus's life seemed secure, but the oath that he had so cleverly created, the oath of Tyndareus that bound all of Helen's suitors to one another, was about to reshape his entire existence in ways he could never have predicted or anticipated. When Helen ran away with Paris of Troy, when the Spartan prince somehow seduced or abducted the most beautiful woman in Greece and took her back to the distant, powerful kingdom of Troy, on the coast of Asia Minor, when the crime sparked a rage that rippled through the entire Greek world like an earthquake, Odysseus found himself bound by the very mechanism he had created. All the suitors had sworn to defend Helen's chosen husband. Helen's chosen husband was Menelaus, king of Sparta, and Menelaus was devastated, furious, and absolutely determined that every Greek king and prince join him in retrieving his wife and restoring Greek honor by punishing Troy. Odysseus did not want to go to war. He had a wife he loved, a young son he had barely gotten to know, and a small kingdom that desperately needed his attention and leadership. The prospect of leaving Ithaca for a long, uncertain, probably brutal war on a distant continent held absolutely no appeal for him. He could see with the sharp prescience of his strategic mind that such a war would be catastrophic. It would last far longer than anyone initially anticipated. It would demand enormous sacrifice. It would claim lives of men he knew and cared about. Every instinct told him to refuse, to find some way to avoid participating. So when Menelaus's messengers arrived in Ithaca with their demands that Odysseus participate, demands backed by the force of the oath he had created, the king of Ithaca decided to attempt something desperate and clever. He would feign complete madness. When the messengers arrived in Ithaca and began looking for Odysseus, they found him engaged in behavior so bizarre that it could only be interpreted as insanity. He had harnessed a donkey and a horse together to his plough, animals that had no business pulling a plough together, creating an obvious and grotesque absurdity. Then he had begun ploughing the beach, deliberately sowing salt into the sand instead of grain seeds, an action so clearly senseless and lunatic that no sane man would engage in it. Surely, Odysseus calculated, when these messengers returned to Menelaus and reported what they had witnessed, the Greeks would accept that Odysseus was too mad to be useful in warfare. His obligation would be excused. He could remain on Ithaca with his wife and son. But Menelaus, perhaps anticipating that someone might try such tricks, had sent not just any messenger. He had sent Palamedes, a man renowned throughout Greece for his own cunning and strategic brilliance. Palamedes was known as someone who could see through deception, who could match Odysseus himself in terms of cleverness. Palamedes arrived in Ithaca and immediately observed what Odysseus was doing. He watched the ploughing of the beach, the sowing of salt, the obvious display of madness, and Palamedes understood instantly what was happening. But he also understood something else. He understood how to call Odysseus's bluff, while Odysseus continued his performance of madness, ploughing and sowing salt with exaggerated motions designed to demonstrate his complete detachment from reality. Palamedes took action. He removed Odysseus's newborn son from his cradle in the palace. He walked calmly out to the beach where Odysseus was ploughing, and he placed the infant, the precious beloved child of Odysseus and Penelope, directly in the path of the oncoming plough, directly in the line of the approaching animals and the sharp blade. In that instant, Odysseus faced a choice that revealed his true nature and his core values. He could continue his performance of madness, could maintain the deception, and let the plough strike his own child. He could prove his madness was genuine by doing nothing, by allowing the machinery to proceed unimpeded. Or he could reveal his sanity by swerving to avoid harm to his son, by breaking character and demonstrating that his madness was only an act. Odysseus swerved. In that moment, he revealed that he was not mad at all. His secret was exposed. His elaborate plan to avoid the war had completely failed. He had been outwitted by Palamedes, caught in a trap that had no escape. Though Odysseus would forgive Palamedes publicly, making a show of accepting the man's superior cunning and celebrating the victory, the incident created a wound that festered in Odysseus's heart. A grudge took root in his mind. He would not forget being outwitted this way, would not forget the humiliation of having his son used as a pawn, would not forget that another man had proven cleverer than him in a crucial moment. This grudge would have consequences far into the future, would eventually lead to betrayal and tragedy for Palamedes that neither man could foresee in this moment. Odysseus had no choice but to honor the oath he had created years before. He had no alternative but to participate in the war. He made his preparations. He spent what he feared might be his final days with Penelope. He held his young son and tried to memorize the feeling of him, tried to burn this moment into his memory. He walked the beaches of Ithaca, knowing that he might never see them again. And then, with a heart full of dread and resignation, he prepared his ships. He sailed with the Greek forces toward Troy. As his ship pulled away from Ithaca's rocky shores, moving out into open water, he did not know, could not have known, that he was beginning a journey that would last not 10 years, but 20. 10 years fighting at Troy, and 10 additional years desperately, nearly impossibly, trying to return home. The Trojan War, when he finally arrived at it, was everything Odysseus had feared and more. It was brutal in ways that exceeded even the pessimistic predictions of his strategic mind. It was prolonged beyond all reasonable expectation, stretching year after year with no end in sight. The war became about grinding attrition and slow destruction rather than glorious heroism and decisive victories. Greeks and Trojans battered each other in the shadow of Troy's massive walls, neither side able to achieve a decisive victory that would end the conflict. Both sides remained locked in a stalemate that seemed as if it might continue forever, as if the war had become a permanent condition of existence rather than a temporary conflict. For 10 years, Odysseus fought. He proved himself a capable warrior, not the strongest, not the most physically impressive, not the one whose strength was legendary, but strategic, resourceful, always finding the angle that others missed, always thinking several moves ahead. Where Achilles solved problems through overwhelming strength and Ajax through solid reliability, Odysseus solved them through intelligence and cunning. He understood that war was not simply about winning individual battles and demonstrating strength in combat. War was about undermining enemy morale, about securing and protecting supply lines, about understanding the psychological dimension of conflict. But it was during the 10th year of the war, when the Greeks were losing faith and losing men and losing the will to continue, when morale was crumbling and desperation was setting in, that Odysseus's true genius revealed itself in a way that no one could have anticipated. Troy's walls seemed impregnable. They had been built by the gods themselves, according to legend. They stood so high and so thick that no conventional military assault could breach them. The walls had withstood 10 years of siege and assault. Conventional siege warfare had failed. Direct assault had failed repeatedly. The Greeks were running out of ideas and running out of hope. Some advisors were suggesting withdrawal, suggesting that the Greeks admit defeat and end this endless war through simple retreat. But Odysseus, his mind still sharp despite 10 years of combat and exhaustion, conceived a plan so audacious, so completely outside normal military thinking, that it seemed insane. He would build a massive wooden horse. The idea was to construct an enormous horse from wood, large enough to hold a significant number of soldiers inside its hollow body. The horse would appear to be some kind of offering or monument, perhaps a gift to the Trojan gods, perhaps a memorial to the dead. The Greeks would make a show of loading their ships and sailing away, as if they were finally departing, finally giving up the long siege. The Trojans, believing the Greeks were finally leaving after 10 years of futile warfare, would see the massive wooden horse left behind on the beach. They would debate what to do with it. And here, Odysseus understood with deep clarity, human nature would likely drive them to bring it inside their city walls, perhaps as a trophy of their victory, perhaps as an offering to their gods, perhaps simply because the alternative, destroying it or leaving it outside, would feel like unnecessary caution after so many years of siege had come to an end. Once the horse was inside Troy's walls, once night fell and the city slept, the Greek soldiers hidden inside would emerge. They would open the gates from the inside. The waiting Greek forces, which had not truly sailed away but were hiding nearby in coves and harbours, would pour through those opened gates and pour into the city. It was a plan based on a fundamental and profound understanding of human nature. People see what they expect to see. They believe what they want to believe. They hope for what they desperately need to be true. The Trojans wanted to believe the war was finally over. The Greeks, understanding this, would create an object that gave them permission to believe it, and Odysseus would manipulate that belief into catastrophe for Troy. The horse was built. It took weeks of labour, with the Greeks working in secret, constructing the massive wooden horse from timber harvested from nearby forests. Every detail was perfected. The horse was large enough to hold dozens of soldiers comfortably. It had a hidden door that could be opened from the inside. It was constructed masterfully, making it beautiful as well as functional. When it was complete, when every detail had been perfected, the Greek army made a show of boarding their ships. The soldiers loaded supplies. They prepared to sail. And then, with great ceremony and visible sadness, they sailed away, or at least appeared to. Most of the fleet did sail, carrying many soldiers away from Troy. But Odysseus and the chosen soldiers who would hide in the horse remained behind, along with ships that stayed near but hidden, waiting for the signal. The Trojans watched from their walls as the Greek ships disappeared over the horizon. For 10 years they had maintained their siege. For 10 years they had survived starvation and constant assault. For 10 years they had held the city. And finally, it seemed, the Greeks were leaving. The massive wooden horse sat abandoned on the beach. The Trojan city erupted in celebration and joy. Walls that had seemed impregnable for a decade suddenly felt like protection that could finally be lowered. The population emerged from their defensive positions. People wept with relief. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but even in celebration, there was debate about the horse. Some Trojans urged extreme caution. Some wanted to burn it, wanted to destroy it completely, wanted to eliminate this mysterious object left behind by the Greeks. Some feared it was a trick, a trap, a mechanism designed to bring destruction into the city. But others, including some of the Trojans' most influential leaders, argued that the horse was clearly a monument to the Trojans' victory, or perhaps a gift to their gods. To destroy it would be disrespectful. To leave it outside the city would be foolish, leaving some reminder of Greek ambition sitting on the beaches forever. The consensus grew that the horse should be brought inside the city, should be placed in a position of honor, should be a permanent reminder of their triumph. The Trojans built ramps and used tremendous effort and energy to drag the massive wooden horse through Troy's gates and into the city itself. It was a monumental task, requiring hundreds of people to pull it up the ramps and through the narrow gates. When it was finally inside, when the great doors were sealed behind it, the Trojans celebrated into the night. They drank wine, feasted, allowed themselves to believe that their long ordeal was over. Men who had lived their entire lives in preparation for war could finally imagine a future of peace. And then, as the city slept, as the celebrations died down and Trojans drifted off to rest, believing themselves finally safe, Odysseus's plan unfolded perfectly. The Greek soldiers concealed inside the horse emerged silently. They were led by Odysseus and by Ajax the Lesser. They killed the Trojan guards at the gates without raising an alarm. They opened the great gates wide. The Greek forces that had been hiding nearby came rushing in. Before the Trojans could mount an effective defense, before they could even fully understand what was happening, before they could process that they had been deceived so completely and so catastrophically, the city was overrun. Troy fell. After 10 years of stalemate, after 10 years of failure through conventional siege warfare and direct assault, after 10 years of grinding warfare that had claimed thousands of lives on both sides, Troy fell in a single night through the application of intelligence and strategic thinking. Odysseus had won the war with his mind, not with his sword. He had achieved victory through understanding human nature, through recognizing the power of desire and hope, through creating a trap that his enemies would willingly enter because it offered them what they wanted to believe. It was perhaps his greatest triumph, the moment that would define him in history and legend. But triumph, as Odysseus would discover over the course of his long and eventful life, was often merely the prelude to unexpected and catastrophic suffering. But triumph, as Odysseus would discover over the course of his long and eventful life, was often merely the prelude to unexpected and catastrophic suffering. The moment Troy's walls fell and the city burned, the moment the Greek forces poured through the gates and began their systematic conquest of the great city that had resisted them for a decade, Odysseus should have felt vindication. He should have felt the satisfaction of victory, the relief of knowing that the endless war was finally over, that he could begin the journey home to Ithaca and to the wife and son who had waited for him for 10 long years. Instead, he felt something colder and stranger. Dread. As a man whose mind moved in strategic patterns, who thought several moves ahead, who understood consequences before they unfolded, Odysseus recognized something that other Greeks in their celebration might have missed. They had won the war through deception. They had conquered Troy not through honor or direct combat, but through manipulation of human nature and exploitation of hope itself. And Odysseus, who had orchestrated that deception so completely, who had weaponized cunning into victory, suddenly understood a truth that gods had known since the dawn of time. When you deceive the gods' favorites, when you destroy great cities, when you achieve victory through means the divine world considers beneath the dignity of heroic warfare, there are consequences, terrible, far-reaching consequences. The Greek forces celebrated as Troy burned. They gathered treasures and captives. They prepared their ships for the journey home, believing their ordeal was finally over. But Odysseus, even in the midst of celebration, began making preparations of a different kind. He performed sacrifices to the gods. He made offerings to Poseidon in particular, the god of the sea whose domain he would have to cross to return home. He tried, through ritual and prayer, to appease divine forces he sensed he had offended. His efforts were too late. Poseidon, god of earthquakes and storms and the vengeful sea, had noticed Odysseus. The sea god had watched as the clever mortal orchestrated the fall of Troy, a city beloved by the Trojans, many of whom were descended from gods themselves. Poseidon had seen the deception, the manipulation, the triumph of cunning over honor. And Poseidon, an ancient god with a temperament that could shift from generous to wrathful in moments, decided that Odysseus needed to be taught a lesson about the limits of mortal cleverness. The journey home, which should have taken weeks, became a nightmare that would stretch across 10 additional years. When Odysseus and his fleet set sail from Troy, when the ships pulled away from the smoking ruins and pointed their bows toward Greece, toward home, toward wives and children, and the familiar shores of their kingdoms, they had no way of knowing that the trials they had already endured were merely a prelude to something far more terrible. The first stop on their journey was the land of the Caecones, a people who had been allies of Troy. In the aftermath of Troy's fall, with victory intoxicating their senses and their defences down, Odysseus's men raided the Caecones city. They took plunder and captives. They celebrated another victory. Odysseus tried to organise an orderly retreat, tried to convince his men to leave quickly before they attracted attention, but his warnings were ignored. The men, drunk on victory and wine, wanted to continue celebrating. It cost them dearly. The Caecones, rather than being crushed by the raid, sent word to their allies. They sent messages across the sea. And by the time Odysseus managed to get his men back to their ships and sailing away, the Caecones had called upon their gods to curse the Greek raiders. A terrible storm rose up, not a natural storm born from the collision of weather patterns, but a divine storm, sent by forces that Odysseus could sense but not see. The storm battered his fleet. Ships were separated. Men were drowned. The vessels that survived were blown far off course, scattered across waters in directions opposite from where they intended to go. What should have been a brief journey home became the beginning of an Odyssey, a word that would eventually come to mean a long, complicated journey filled with trials and tribulations. Days after the storm scattered them, Odysseus's ship found itself approaching an island shrouded in mist. The crew was exhausted, desperate for rest and fresh water. They pulled ashore and discovered an island that seemed like paradise. There were strange, sweet flowers growing everywhere. The scent of them filled the air with an intoxicating fragrance. The people of the island, the Lotus-Eaters, greeted the Greeks with hospitality and offered them food and drink. It seemed like a blessing after so much hardship. But when his men ate the lotus flowers offered by the island's inhabitants, something strange and terrible began to happen. The flowers had a narcotic effect, filling the minds of those who consumed them with a sense of contentment and peace so complete that nothing else mattered. Men who had been desperate to return home, who had spoken constantly of wives and children and the islands they were trying to reach, suddenly forgot all of it. They wanted nothing more than to stay on the island, to eat more lotus flowers, to drift in a state of peaceful numbness forever. Odysseus watched in horror as his men became content slaves to the lotus flowers' effects. He realized immediately that if he did not act, if he did not remove them from this island by force, he would lose them forever. They would stay here, drifting in peaceful oblivion until they wasted away and died. He gathered his men forcibly, literally restraining some of them, carrying others by force, and dragged them back to the ship. Some of them fought him, desperate to return to the lotus flowers, desperate to recapture that perfect contentment. But Odysseus was firm. He tied them to the rowing benches. He ordered the ships to sail immediately, pushing away from the island's shores before more of his crew could be tempted. As they rowed away, Odysseus understood a truth that would shape everything that came after. The greatest dangers did not always come from enemies or storms or physical threats. Sometimes the greatest dangers came from seductive peace, from comfort that promised to make the struggle meaningless, from contentment that demanded surrender. The next island they encountered seemed uninhabited. Odysseus and a scouting party went ashore to explore, looking for fresh water and supplies. What they found instead was a cave, a massive cavern that clearly belonged to something large and powerful. Inside the cave, they discovered supplies, enormous wheels of cheese, buckets of milk, massive portions of food clearly belonging to some creature that made this place its home. Some of Odysseus's men wanted to grab what they could and leave immediately, but others, hungry after weeks of deprivation, wanted to stay and eat, they sat down in the cave and began consuming the cheese and drinking the milk, arguing about whether they should wait to meet the cave's inhabitant or flee while they could. The decision was made for them when the creature returned. Polyphemus was a Cyclops, one of the one-eyed giants born from the union of Poseidon and a nymph. He was enormous, easily 12 feet tall, with a single massive eye in the center of his forehead. He moved slowly, carrying a staff that was itself larger than a tree. And when he entered his cave and saw the Greek intruders eating his food, his rage was immediate and catastrophic. He sealed the cave entrance by moving an enormous boulder into place, a boulder so massive that no human strength could move it. Then, with the casual cruelty of a being vastly more powerful than those around him, Polyphemus reached out and grabbed one of Odysseus's men. The Greek soldier screamed as the Cyclops lifted him into the air, and then, with shocking brutality, Polyphemus bashed the man's head against the stone floor of the cave, killing him instantly. The Cyclops then calmly proceeded to tear the body apart and eat it, consuming the Greek soldier as if he were a piece of meat, which from Polyphemus's perspective, he was. Odysseus and the surviving men huddled in the darkness of the cave, watching in horror as their companion was devoured. They were trapped. The entrance was sealed. The creature that trapped them was vastly more powerful than any of them. They had no weapons that could harm something so large and so strong. All they could do was wait and hope for some possibility of escape. But Odysseus, even in the face of what seemed like certain death, continued to think. The Cyclops, after his meal, settled down to sleep, his single enormous eye closing, his breathing becoming deep and regular. Odysseus looked around the cave, analyzing the situation with the part of his mind that never stopped thinking strategically, even in the face of catastrophe. He found a massive wooden staff in the cave, a post of olive wood that Polyphemus had apparently carved himself. It was enormous, thick as a tree trunk, and pointed at one end. Odysseus gathered his men and explained his plan in whispered tones. When the Cyclops woke, they would need to be ready. They would need to work together. They would need to take the wooden staff, heat the pointed end in the cave's fire until it was glowing red hot, and then drive it directly into the creature's single eye while it slept. It was a desperate, dangerous plan. It would require perfect timing and perfect coordination, but it was the only possibility they had. The Cyclops woke after several hours of sleep, and following the pattern he had established, he reached out and grabbed another one of Odysseus's men. The soldier screamed as Polyphemus lifted him, as the giant bent him toward his mouth, as the terrible jaws closed around him. Another man was dead, devoured like food. Odysseus watched in controlled rage. He could feel the burning desire for revenge, for justice, for some way to hurt this creature as it was hurting his men. But he controlled that rage, channeled it into strategic thinking. He had to wait for the right moment. He had to ensure the plan would work. After eating his second course of Greek soldier, Polyphemus lay back down to sleep, and this time, Odysseus was ready. He and several of his strongest men moved the wooden staff to the fire. They heated it until the pointed end glowed bright red, so hot that the air around it shimmered. They positioned themselves carefully around the sleeping Cyclops. And then, at Odysseus's signal, they moved. They lifted the massive staff together, carrying it to where the sleeping Cyclops lay. And then, with coordinated force, they drove the heated point directly into the creature's single eye. The Cyclops' scream was unlike anything the Greeks had ever heard. It was a sound of absolute agony and rage, a sound so loud and terrible that it echoed through the entire cave and out into the night beyond. Polyphemus thrashed and convulsed, his hands going to his eye, finding the burned flesh and the wooden staff embedded in it. He pulled the staff out, blood and fluid pouring down his face, his single eye destroyed forever. He was blind. But being blind did not make the Cyclops harmless. If anything, it made him more dangerous. In his blinding pain and rage, Polyphemus moved around the cave with furious violence, swinging his enormous arms, trying to catch the Greeks who had blinded him. He roared in agony and fury, his screams echoing for miles. The Greeks scattered, trying to avoid the swinging arms of the maddened giant. And then Polyphemus did something unexpected. He moved to the cave entrance and, with a tremendous effort, rolled the massive boulder away. He seemed to be moving at random, but there was purpose to his actions. He was leaving, stumbling out of the cave despite his blindness, driven by the intensity of his pain and his desperate need to escape the source of his agony. When the boulder rolled away, leaving the cave entrance open, Odysseus saw his chance. He gathered his surviving men and began attempting to escape, but Polyphemus had not abandoned them. The blinded Cyclops had gone to sit just outside the cave entrance, his hands extended to catch anyone who tried to leave. Odysseus looked around desperately for another way out, and his eyes fell upon the massive rams that Polyphemus kept in his cave, enormous sheep with wool thick as felt. Odysseus understood immediately what he had to do. He tied his men under the largest rams, 3 Greeks clinging to the wool and body of each giant sheep. The rams, at dawn, naturally wanted to leave the cave and go out to pasture. When they moved, heading toward the entrance, the blinded Polyphemus felt them, but did not hurt them. The Cyclops allowed his beloved animals to pass, assuming they were unaccompanied. Hidden beneath the rams, clinging to the wool, Odysseus's surviving men managed to escape from the cave and move away from the Cyclops' position. When they were far enough away, when they could see the ships in the distance, the Greeks emerged from their hiding places beneath the rams and ran for the vessels. As they ran, Odysseus felt a terrible temptation, a desire to turn back, to reveal himself to the Cyclops, to boast about what he had done, to ensure that Polyphemus knew exactly who had defeated him. It was the same impulse that had driven him to raid the Cicones. It was the desire for glory, for acknowledgement, for the world to know about his cleverness and his victory. He almost gave in to it. As his men rowed the ships away from the island, as they put distance between themselves and the blinded Cyclops, Odysseus stood at the bow of his vessel. And despite all his strategic thinking, despite his understanding of consequences and his knowledge that drawing attention to himself was unwise, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back at Polyphemus. "Hey, Cyclops, you might want to know that it was Odysseus of Ithaca who blinded you. Remember that name, you monster. It was the cunning of Odysseus that defeated your strength." For a moment, the words hung in the air. Odysseus' men stared at him in shock, understanding immediately that he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to take the words back. Polyphemus, hearing the name, understanding who had defeated him, went into a rage that transcended the pain of his ruined eye. He moved to a cliff overlooking the sea and picked up an enormous boulder, a piece of the mountain itself, with the strength of a god-descended being, with the fury of a creature betrayed and maimed. Polyphemus hurled the boulder toward the sound of Odysseus's voice. The boulder fell short, but not by much. It hit the water behind the ship, creating a wave so massive that it propelled the Greek vessel forward, actually helping it escape. Polyphemus threw another boulder, then another, but each one missed, and the ships continued pulling away, moving out of range. As they sailed away, Odysseus heard Polyphemus cry out, a terrible, anguished sound. The Cyclops called upon his father, Poseidon. He begged the god of the sea to curse the man named Odysseus. He asked Poseidon to ensure that Odysseus never reached home, that if he did reach home, he should arrive alone, having lost everything, and that he should face terrible suffering upon his return. And Poseidon, already angered by Odysseus's role in Troy's destruction, already watching the clever mortal with divine disapproval, heard his son's prayers. The god of the sea accepted the curse. Poseidon dedicated himself to ensuring that Odysseus would suffer for his arrogance, for his boasting, for his blindness to the consequences of his actions. This curse, uttered by a Cyclops and accepted by one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon, would shape everything that followed. It would be the force that kept Odysseus from home for 10 additional years. It would be the divine power that drove storms against his ships, that created obstacles where there should have been clear paths, that ensured that every time Odysseus seemed close to reaching Ithaca, something terrible would happen to prevent him. The curse of Polyphemus was perhaps the most consequential boast ever made, and Odysseus would spend the next decade paying for his moment of arrogance. The next island they reached was inhabited by a being of a very different kind. Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus lived on a floating island surrounded by walls of bronze, a being who had been given power by Zeus himself to control the winds, to release them or bind them according to his will. Odysseus and his men were received by Aeolus with genuine hospitality. The wind god recognized Odysseus from the tales that had spread from Troy, and he honored the clever mortal who had engineered the city's fall. For a month, Odysseus and his men rested on Aeolus's island, feasting and telling stories of their adventures. When they prepared to leave, when they begged Aeolus for help in getting home, the wind god took pity on them. He gathered all the adverse winds and bound them tightly in a leather bag, a magical container that would prevent them from escaping. Then he tied the bag securely and gave it to Odysseus. "Keep this closed," Aeolus instructed. "Inside are all the winds that would blow you off course. Only the gentle west wind have I left free. It will blow you directly toward Ithaca. If you keep the bag sealed, if you do not open it, you will reach home in 10 days. Odysseus accepted the gift with gratitude. He secured the bag carefully in his cabin on the ship, and the Greek fleet set sail, propelled by the gentle west wind, moving steadily toward home. For 9 days they sailed, getting closer and closer to Ithaca with each passing hour. Odysseus could almost taste home. He could almost see the rocky shores of his island kingdom. After years of war and months of trials, he was finally approaching the end of his journey. But on the 10th day, just as they were coming within sight of Ithaca, as the island was visible on the horizon, as Odysseus was allowing himself to believe that the curse was finally ending, something terrible happened. While Odysseus slept in his cabin, exhausted from weeks of tension and careful navigation, his crew began to speculate about the leather bag. They had noticed that Odysseus kept it locked away, that he never opened it, that he guarded it carefully, and in their tired, desperate minds, they began to wonder what could possibly be so valuable, so precious, that Odysseus would hoard it so carefully. Some of them began to suspect that the bag contained treasure, gold or jewels, or some other precious cargo. They wondered why Odysseus would keep such wealth to himself. They became convinced that Odysseus was hiding something, that he was not being fair with his crew, that he was planning to use whatever was in the bag for his own benefit, rather than sharing it equally. The more they thought about it, the more resentful they became. And so, while Odysseus slept, while he was unaware of what was happening, his crew went to the cabin and opened the leather bag. The moment they untied it, the moment they undid Aeolus's careful binding, every adverse wind that had been contained inside came rushing out at once. The bag released all the storms, all the difficult winds, all the forces that would blow ships off course. The sky exploded with chaos. The sea erupted into violence. The ships, which had been sailing peacefully toward home just moments before, were suddenly caught in a maelstrom of wind and wave. Odysseus woke to the violent pitching of his ship, to the sound of his men screaming, to the realization that everything they had gained in the past 9 days was being undone in moments. The ships were blown backward, driven away from Ithaca by the force of 1,000 winds released at once. In a matter of hours, they were driven all the way back to Aeolus's floating island. Odysseus, devastated and furious, climbed back out of his ship and made his way to Aeolus's palace. He went to the wind god and explained what had happened. He told Aeolus about how his crew had opened the bag, how the winds had escaped, how they had been blown backward. Aeolus listened in silence, and when Odysseus finished speaking, the wind god refused to help him again. "The gods have clearly marked you as someone they do not wish to return home," Aeolus said coldly. "I cannot help someone who has been cursed by forces greater than myself. To do so would invite their wrath upon my island. You must leave, and you must not return." There was no negotiation, no second chance. Odysseus and his men were forced to leave Aeolus's island and continue their journey without divine assistance, sailing by their own power and their own skill. But worse than the setback, worse than being blown backward at the moment of near success, was the realization that Odysseus now had to face. His own crew had betrayed him. They had acted without his knowledge or permission. They had undone 9 days of careful sailing in moments of blind suspicion and resentment. It revealed something that Odysseus had not fully considered before. His men did not trust him. They suspected him of hoarding treasure, of not being fair, of prioritizing his own interests over theirs. And that suspicion, that betrayal of trust, would haunt the remainder of the journey. The ships continued onward, now without the helpful wind, now forced to rely on rowing and on whatever natural winds they could catch. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The crew grew more exhausted, more desperate, more vulnerable to despair. They came to an island inhabited by the Laestrygonians, a race of giants who were even larger and more ferocious than the Cyclops. When Odysseus's fleet entered a harbour on this island seeking shelter, they found themselves in a death trap. The Laestrygonians lined the cliffs surrounding the harbour and began pelting the ships with boulders, destroying them almost casually, crushing the vessels and drowning the men who crewed them. Odysseus's ship managed to escape, rowing frantically out of the harbour, while ships around them were crushed and destroyed. But of the 12 ships that had sailed from Troy with him, only one remained. The crews of all the other vessels were slaughtered, their bodies sinking into the sea, their names lost to history. Odysseus and the remnants of his crew rowed onward, shattered by yet another catastrophic loss, by the knowledge that they had lost hundreds of men, that they were now a tiny fraction of the force that had left Troy. They pulled ashore on an island to rest and mourn their lost companions. And it was there that Odysseus encountered magic of a different kind. Not the cruelty of gods or giants, but the subtle, transformative power of a goddess. The island was inhabited by Circe. She was a goddess who lived in a palace surrounded by gardens, a being of power and beauty and dangerous knowledge. And when Odysseus's men encountered her, when they were invited to her halls and offered food and hospitality, Odysseus began to understand something that would reshape his entire journey and his understanding of himself. For it was Circe who would teach him that the greatest battle was not against external enemies, but against his own nature, against the pride and arrogance that kept leading him into disaster. And it was in her company that Odysseus would finally begin to understand what true wisdom really meant. Circe's hospitality was unlike anything Odysseus had experienced since leaving Troy. She welcomed his men with genuine warmth, offered them food and wine and comfort after their weeks of hardship and despair. And then, with terrible magic born from disappointment and isolation, she transformed them into swine, penning them with the other men she had transformed in her years of solitude on the island. When Odysseus learned what had happened to his crew, when he discovered that his men had been reduced to animals rooting in pens, something shifted in him. This was not a problem that could be solved through strategic thinking or clever manipulation. This was a crisis that demanded something he had never truly learned: humility. Hermes appeared to him on the path to Circe's palace, offering protection against her magic. The god gave him moly, an herb that would shield him from transformation. And then Hermes offered him counsel that would prove more valuable than any magical protection. She is not evil, Hermes told him. She is lonely. She is isolated. She is powerful and feared, and she has learned to protect herself through transformation of those who threaten her. But she respects courage, respects honesty, respects those who approach her as equals rather than as victims or conquerors. Odysseus took the herb. He went to Circe's palace, and when she offered him wine and attempted her magic, when it failed to transform him, when she realized he was protected, Odysseus made a choice that surprised them both. Rather than draw his sword and demand his men's release, rather than threaten or negotiate from a position of apparent strength, Odysseus knelt before her. "I have lost so many men," he said quietly. "I have watched my crew dwindle from thousands to dozens. I have been cursed by a god for my arrogance. I have been betrayed by those I trusted. And now I have failed to protect my remaining men from your magic. I do not ask for your mercy because I am strong. I ask for it because I am broken, and I need your help to heal." It was a moment of radical vulnerability from a man whose entire life had been built on the appearance of strength and capability. And Circe, who had spent centuries transforming men because they saw her only as something to take or conquer, found herself facing a man who saw her as someone to understand. She released his men from their transformation. She offered them genuine hospitality, and over the course of weeks, Odysseus remained on her island. Not as a prisoner, not as a guest being seduced into forgetting his home, but as someone learning a new way of existing in the world. Circe taught him things that no battle could have taught, no amount of strategic thinking could have revealed. She showed him that power expressed through domination was hollow. She demonstrated that true strength lay in understanding rather than conquest. She helped him see that the arrogance that had driven him to boast to the Cyclops, that had made him desperate for recognition and acknowledgement, was the same arrogance that kept leading him into disaster. "You won the Trojan War through cleverness," Circe told him one evening as they sat in her garden. "But you have spent the years since discovering that cleverness alone cannot save you from the consequences of your choices. You need wisdom, Odysseus. And wisdom is not something you can think your way into. Wisdom requires transformation." When Odysseus finally left Circe's island, when he sailed away toward home, he carried with him knowledge that would prove essential for the trials still ahead. She had warned him about the sirens, beings whose voices could drive men mad with longing, whose songs could make sailors crash their ships upon rocks in desperate attempts to reach them. She taught him a strategy. He would stuff his men's ears with beeswax so they could not hear the song. But Odysseus himself would remain exposed to the music. He would have his men tie him to the mast, so that if he tried to steer the ship toward the sirens, he would be physically prevented from doing so. It was a method that acknowledged truth. Sometimes we cannot simply avoid temptation through will alone. Sometimes we need external constraints. Sometimes we need others to help us remain true to our goals when temptation threatens to overwhelm us. The passage past the sirens proved even more dangerous than Circe had described. Their song was beyond beautiful. It was a sound that contained within it all the longing, all the yearning, all the deepest desires that Odysseus had ever felt. It was a voice that sang of home, of return, of reunion with Penelope. It was a sound designed specifically to exploit his most desperate wish. Odysseus strained against the bonds holding him to the mast. He screamed at his men to unbind him, to steer the ship toward the sirens. He begged and pleaded with the intensity of a man completely overwhelmed by desire. His men, unable to hear the song because of the beeswax in their ears, simply rowed harder, following Odysseus's earlier instructions, pressing onward despite his desperate attempts to deviate from their course. And gradually, as they moved past the sirens, as the distance increased, the song faded. The spell weakened. Odysseus regained control of his mind and his body. He realized he was weeping. Tears of longing and frustration, and the terrible recognition of how close he had come to destroying everything through surrender to desire. But the sirens were not the only danger that awaited them. Between two narrow straits lay two separate threats, each one capable of destroying a ship completely. On one side was Scylla, a monster with multiple heads and tentacles, born from the jealousy and magic of a goddess. On the other side was Charybdis, a creature that had become something like a whirlpool itself, a being that swallowed entire ships whole and then regurgitated what remained. Odysseus had to choose which danger to face. There was no safe passage. There was no way to avoid both threats entirely. He could either lose some of his men to Scylla's heads, which would pluck individual sailors from the deck, or he could risk losing the entire ship to Charybdis's terrible appetite. It was an impossible choice, the kind that no strategic thinking could make acceptable, no amount of cleverness could make feel like victory. Odysseus had to accept that some losses could not be prevented. Some sacrifices were inevitable, and sometimes leadership meant making choices that would haunt you forever, knowing that whatever decision you made, someone would suffer for it. He chose Scylla. As the ship sailed through the narrow strait, as the monster's heads emerged from the water, as her tentacles reached down and plucked 6 of his men from the deck, Odysseus stood and watched, unable to stop it, unable to prevent the loss. His men screamed as they were pulled into the creature's mouths, and Odysseus felt the weight of that failure settle on his shoulders. The knowledge that he had made a choice that resulted in their deaths. But such was the nature of survival. Such was the cost of leadership. Beyond Scylla and Charybdis lay one more island, the island where Helios, the sun god, kept his sacred cattle. The herds were magnificent, immortal creatures that never aged or diminished, maintained in perfect condition by Helios's divine will. The animals were off limits. They were sacred. Odysseus had been warned explicitly. If his men harmed even a single cow, there would be terrible consequences. His crew was starving. They had not eaten in days. The smell of the cattle, the sight of so much potential food, became unbearable. While Odysseus slept, his men decided to hunt one of the sacred cows. They killed it, butchered it, prepared it as a meal. And as they ate, as they violated the most explicit prohibition Odysseus had been given, the consequences began to manifest. The cattle's hides began to move on their own, to twitch and writhe. The meat being roasted spoke with human voices. The entire universe seemed to shudder in response to the violation of sacred law. Odysseus woke to catastrophe. He realized immediately what his men had done, and he knew, with the clarity of someone who had witnessed divine punishment before, that this transgression could not go unpunished. The gods allowed them to leave the island. But as soon as they sailed into open water, Poseidon sent a storm unlike any Odysseus had experienced. The god of the sea, still pursuing his vendetta against the mortal who had blinded his son years before, sent waves that towered like mountains, sent winds that shredded the sails, sent lightning that struck the mast and split it in two. The ship began to sink. Odysseus watched as his men were thrown into the raging sea. He watched them struggle against currents that pulled them under. He heard their screams as the waves consumed them. And one by one, every single member of his crew, all the men who had survived Troy, who had survived the Cicones, who had survived the Cyclops, and the Laestrygonians, and the Sirens and Scylla, drowned in Poseidon's wrath. Odysseus alone remained. He clung to a piece of wreckage from the destroyed ship, floating in an endless sea with no crew, no supplies, no hope of rescue. For days he drifted, moving in directions determined entirely by currents and wind. He was alone in a way he had never been before, completely, utterly alone, with no one to lead, no one to protect, no one to share the burden of survival. And slowly, through currents and chance, the wreckage drifted toward an island. It was the island of Calypso, a nymph who had fallen in love with the idea of Odysseus before she ever met him. She had seen him in prophecy, had learned of his cleverness and his struggles, and had decided that he was the one being in the entire universe worth devoting herself to. When she pulled his half-drowned form from the sea, when she nursed him back to health, she offered him something he had been denied for years: peace. Calypso offered him immortality. She offered him the chance to stay on her island forever, to live in luxury and comfort, to spend eternity with someone who had chosen him, who wanted him, who would make him the center of her existence. It was a seductive offer, perhaps the most seductive offer a mortal could receive from a divine being. Odysseus stayed for 7 years. 7 years of comfort, 7 years of peace, 7 years of being cared for, being desired, being safe from storms and monsters and the complications of the mortal world. 7 years of what could have been happiness. If only Odysseus had been capable of forgetting, but he could not forget. Every day Odysseus walked to the highest cliff on Calypso's island and looked out toward the horizon, toward the direction where Ithaca lay. Every day he wept for his wife, for his son, for the home he had left behind decades before. Every day, the weight of those decades pressed down on him, the knowledge that his wife was waiting, that his son had grown to manhood without a father, that his kingdom might be crumbling in his absence. Calypso, watching his daily pilgrimage to the cliff, watching him grieve for a life she could not give him, finally understood something essential. Love expressed through containment was not love at all. Love required wanting someone's happiness, even if their happiness meant losing them. She released him. She helped him build a raft from the wood on the island. She provided him with supplies and guidance, and she waved goodbye as he sailed away toward Ithaca, knowing she would never see him again, knowing that he would forget her, knowing that the cost of love was sometimes accepting loss. But Poseidon, watching from his depths, saw the raft moving toward Ithaca, and the god, still pursuing his vendetta, still not satisfied by the years of suffering he had already inflicted, sent one final storm. The raft was destroyed. Odysseus was thrown into the sea, and he would have drowned, would have finally surrendered to the ocean's embrace, if not for the intervention of a sea nymph who took pity on him. She gave him her girdle to wear, which would keep him buoyant, would prevent him from sinking, would allow him to survive if he had the strength to swim. And so Odysseus swam. For days he swam, fighting against currents, against exhaustion, against the very real possibility that he was swimming toward nothing but more ocean. His arms burned, his legs felt like lead, every breath felt like it might be his last. And then, miraculously, impossibly, he saw land. He pulled himself onto a beach on the island of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians, a people known for their hospitality and their seafaring skill. He collapsed on the sand, completely exhausted, having used every ounce of his strength simply to survive one more day. The next morning, a young princess named Nausicaa found him on the beach. Rather than being afraid of the strange, bedraggled man covered in salt and seaweed and exhaustion, she saw someone in need of help. She brought him to her father's palace. She made sure he was bathed and clothed and fed. And when the king of the Phaeacians asked Odysseus to tell his story, to explain who he was and where he came from, Odysseus finally, for the first time since leaving Troy, told someone the complete truth. He spoke of his cleverness and his arrogance. He spoke of his triumphs and his failures. He spoke of the years of trials, of the crew members he had lost, of the men who had been transformed or killed or drowned because of decisions he had made. And in the telling of it, in the full acknowledgement of his journey and its cost, Odysseus finally began to understand what wisdom truly meant. The king of the Phaeacians, moved by his story, offered to help him return home. His sailors were the finest in the world. They would take Odysseus to Ithaca. They would ensure he arrived safely. Odysseus wept with gratitude and relief. After everything, after 10 years of war, after 10 years of impossible trials, after every loss and every setback and every moment when it seemed impossible that he would ever see home again. He was finally going to return to Ithaca. The voyage took one night. A single night's sailing on the ships of the Phaeacians brought Odysseus to the rocky shores of his island kingdom. They carried him onto the beach while he slept, still exhausted from his years of trials. They left him on the sand with gifts and treasures, intending to depart before he woke. But as their ship sailed away, Poseidon, watching from the depths, sent one final curse. The god was angered that Odysseus was finally arriving home, that the years of vengeance seemed to be ending. So Poseidon turned the Phaeacian ship to stone in the harbour of their home city. A monument to the god's wrath, a reminder to the entire world that those who helped the curse of Poseidon would face consequences. Odysseus woke on the beach of Ithaca, not recognizing it at first. The goddess Athena, who had always favoured him, revealed herself and told him the truth. He had finally come home. But home was not as he had left it. His palace had been invaded by suitors, men from the surrounding islands who believed Odysseus was dead, who wanted to marry Penelope and claim his kingdom and his wealth. Penelope had waited faithfully for 20 years, had resisted their advances through cleverness and delay, but she was beginning to weaken. She could not hold out much longer. Odysseus had returned, but he had returned to a kingdom in crisis, to a situation that demanded he act, that demanded he use his cleverness one final time to protect what remained of his life. With Athena's help, with the assistance of his loyal servants, with the aid of his grown son Telemachus, Odysseus orchestrated a final triumph. He moved through his palace in disguise, observing the suitors who had occupied his home, and then, revealing himself, he strung his great bow, a bow that only he could draw, a bow that no one else possessed the strength to use. One by one he shot the suitors down. They fell like leaves in autumn, struck down by arrows fired by a man who had learned, through decades of suffering and trial, how to transform his grief into purpose, his rage into focused action. When it was over, when every suitor lay dead, when his palace had been cleansed of those who had invaded it, Odysseus finally ascended the stairs to the chamber where Penelope waited. She did not recognize him at first. The man standing before her was older, scarred, weathered by 2 decades of trials. But when she looked into his eyes, when she saw the intelligence and the weariness and the familiarity of a soul she had known her entire adult life, she knew. They wept together, tears of reunion, tears of loss for all the years that had passed, tears of gratitude that they had both survived long enough to find each other again. And so the Odyssey ended. Not with Odysseus being unchanged by his trials, not with him returning as the same man who had left, but as someone fundamentally transformed by the journey itself. He had gone to war as a clever strategist, confident in his ability to solve any problem through wit and cunning. He had returned as a man who had learned that true wisdom lay not in avoiding suffering, but in enduring it, learning from it, and allowing it to reshape his understanding of what mattered. The trials he had faced, the storm, the Cyclops, the Lotus-Eaters, the crew's betrayal, the giants, the sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the 7 years on Calypso's island, none of them had defeated him. Not because he was invincible, not because his cleverness never failed, but because he possessed something more valuable than invincibility or cleverness. He possessed the capacity to endure. He possessed the willingness to change, to learn, to allow each failure to teach him something new. He possessed the humility to accept that his arrogance had consequences, that his pride had cost lives, that true strength sometimes meant admitting weakness. Odysseus's story reminds us that the greatest journey is not the one that leads to distant lands, but the one that leads back to ourselves, changed, scarred, but wiser. It reminds us that coming home is not about arriving at a place, but about arriving at an understanding of who we truly are. And it teaches us that sometimes the truest victory is not defeating our enemies, but becoming someone capable of understanding them, of learning from them, of being transformed by the very struggles that seem designed to destroy us. In the end, Odysseus did not win his war against Poseidon's curse. The curse was never meant to be won against. It was meant to teach, to humble a mortal who had become too confident in his own cleverness, to show him that some forces in the universe were greater than his mind, to force him to develop qualities that strategy and cunning alone could never provide. And in accepting that he could not overcome the curse through force or wit, in enduring it rather than fighting it, in allowing it to transform him, Odysseus finally transcended it. His Odyssey teaches us that wisdom is not the opposite of suffering, but rather something that emerges from it. That home is not a place we return to, but a person we become. And that sometimes the greatest adventure is not the journey outward, but the journey inward, the long, difficult passage from who we are to who we are meant to be.